If there's anything you don't like, just go, yeah, I'm not going to talk about that. And we'll put it in anyway. But,
Perfect.
I'm just kidding. So we're ready to go. Here we go.
Coming up on It's Not Human Sexuality.
And the judge decides that surrogacy and this arrangement is human trafficking.
This is one of my favorite topics. Let's say a couple is doing home insemination with a known donor that's unscreened. They're just using fresh ejaculate at home, syringe, turkey base, or whatever.
Can you conceive children from the genetics of someone who has passed? And now the technology is certainly there.
Your liver doesn't inherit an estate, and your cornea and your ligaments, but your DNA does.
Yeah, the next Ocean's 11 will be about breaking into a sperm
Yes,
bank.
a sperm bank. Yes,
Great.
Absolutely.
Thanks. I
Ocean's
won't be
11
sleeping
plus 1
for a while now on that, but. So welcome to It's Not Human Sexuality, the show that goes beyond sexuality to reproductive health. Understanding the foundations of reproductive health allows you and the ones you love to make better decisions about your health, mind, and relationships. Joining us today is Ellen Trachman.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, in this episode, we're going to learn all the nuances of reproductive law when it comes to third-party parenting. In fact, we're going to learn what third-party parenting actually is. So I'm Dr. B.
And I'm Mandy Johnson, and this is It's Not Human Sexuality.
Yeah. So briefly, Ellen's rocks, right? So she founded Trachman Law Center in order to bring dedicated and compassionate legal representation to those turning to assisted reproductive technology to grow their families. She's also the co-founder of Colorado Surrogacy, a Colorado-focused surrogacy matching and support agency, and she writes a weekly column on assisted reproductive technology legal issues for the website Above the Law. And co-host the podcast, I Want to Put a Baby in You, which I have been on.
Yes, one of our favorite guests.
Yeah, I bet you say that to everybody.
No.
Okay. In 2019, she co-founded Colorado Fertility Advocates, a nonprofit organization supporting fertility patients, professionals, and advocates.
Yes.
So,
thank you.
Yeah.
All of that. I do all of that. Yes.
So to start off, I must confess, I don't exactly remember when we met. I think it was at a panel discussion we were both at. Do you remember that?
I don't remember first meeting you either. I think you're right that it was some kind of panel presentation. And I remember asking you to get coffee with me, like awkwardly asking you on a first date, you don't remember that. And I was like, this Betsy woman, she knows a lot of stuff. And I think I was somewhat newer in the area at that time and trying to get to know everyone. And you were absolutely fascinating. And I appreciated you taking the time to meet with me.
That's so funny because I had the same reaction. I was like, this is somebody I definitely need to get to know. So full disclosure here, though, time has passed and Ellen and her law firm are now part of my other company, Cryogam. They're on our advisory board because with Colorado, well, with any type of state and particularly Colorado, we have reproductive issues and law issues, and Cryogam is no different, that we deal in that. And so it's always good to have a good attorney in your corner.
We are honored to help and to hopefully stop you from having any real issues.
Yes, of course. Just that's the whole goal, is to have no issues, right? Kind of tell us how your path to this, how you got into reproductive law.
Yeah, sure. Totally natural. No, not at all. So I actually always recall in law school when they asked us, they said, okay, raise your hand if you want to do litigation. And like half the class raises their hand. And I said, okay, now everyone raise their hand if you want to do corporate law. And like the other half raises their hand. And that was it. Like that was the two choices when we were in law school, litigation or corporate. And I was like, I don't know. I feel like there's a lot more out there. But despite that, after law school, I ended up working for the 9th largest firm in the world in their investment management group, doing hedge fund law, which obviously is the the precursor to surrogacy. No, not in any way, but hedge funds. And I definitely can tell you, I'd go to parties and so I'd be like, what do you do? And I'd like fall asleep listening to myself. It was terrible. So I can tell you being in this area is much more entertaining at parties, way better stories. But so I was working at this firm in San Francisco, doing hedge fund law. And at the time I was living with some really good friends who were a gay couple, and they were trying to figure out their path to becoming parents. And they were looking into it and thinking they did want to be parents. And at that same time, my sister was going through infertility, and she's who co-hosts the podcast with me now. And she's very open about her story and her struggles. And I became familiar with egg donation and saw this contract, and it was so fascinated that one, it was so horribly written that I was like, wow, an attorney does this? Like, I could do this, and I could do this better, because this person did a really terrible job at this particular contract. But no, maybe that was an off day for them. But I became really fascinated by assisted reproductive technology being an area of law. And I kept getting in my head, like, I should do this. And of course, it was another 7 years of working doing hedge funds before and having kids of my own. And then we decided to move from San Francisco to Denver. And I started working at a corporate job here doing M&A, where you're selling big businesses to other big businesses. Also, not fun for party discussion. But I was like, I'll be very open that so a lot of bad things happened all at once, where my stepbrother committed suicide and my grandmother died, and I had to have knee surgery, and I was lied up watching TED Talks while I was recovering from this knee surgery. They were like, don't regret your life. And I was like, I'm not going to regret my life. So I decided to quit this job I was not feeling fulfilled at and start this dream I'd had for so long. And so I started a firm specializing in assisted reproductive technology law, and went to all the conferences, read all the stuff, and just started building my practice in the area. And it's been an amazing journey ever since, and no regrets.
Very cool.
Yeah, it is very cool. I got to tell you, I just don't see you as a hedge fund attorney.
What?
I know, that's kind of a shocker for me. But
I think that's fair. I feel like I'm too fun to be one.
You and I both know that the courts can't keep up with reproductive technology, and so there's a lot of issues around that. And just briefly explain what third-party parenting is, for our listeners.
Yes. And we would say third-party reproduction versus parenting, because parenting could mean something else, which is actually another area that's fun to talk about. So generally, there's so many different names. We talk about assisted reproductive technology, third-party reproduction, collaborative reproduction, family formation. There's like no clean name for this. But generally, we're talking about when someone else needs to help you to have a child. So the big categories are an egg donor. So that's your third party who's helping someone else have a child, a sperm donor, embryo donation, or a surrogate, or some combination thereof, where someone else, some third party is helping you to have a child. And then, of course, when there's someone else involved, you get lots of fun legal issues.
Yes.
Right. And so in our world, we look at surrogacy as traditional surrogacy, where the egg donor per se is actually going to carry the pregnancy and be half the genetic material, whereas the other is a gestational carrier, where they're just carrying the pregnancy of a formed embryo that was made by an oocyte or egg donor and a sperm donor.
Betsy, I get to update your language, because even like the terminology keeps changing. So when I started, it was called traditional surrogacy, where a woman who is genetically related to the child carried the child. And now the new hip term, so now you're all cut up, is genetic surrogacy, where she is genetically related to the child. So that we've seen a lot of shift in kind of documents and legal references to genetic surrogacy. And genetic surrogacy legally is generally disfavored. So many states that have specific statutes say this only applies to gestational surrogacy, only where the surrogate is not related to the child. There's a few places where it does include it, but those are rarer. And I think partially, one, there's like more like an emotional complication element. There's one thinking like, you can be an egg donor and you can be a surrogate, so why can't you be both at the same time? And the other thinking is like, well, it's a little bit more complicated when you combine them. But the big thing is that I've heard the statistic that gestational surrogacy, where the surrogate is not related, is like 95% of all surrogacies now. So an
Wow.
overwhelming amount of surrogacies where she's not genetically related to the child.
So when you say not favored, does that also mean maybe not legal?
Yes. So depending on the state, so surrogacy law varies state to state. So for example, in New York, they had criminalized compensated surrogacy, both genetic and gestational, for about 30 years after this terrible Mary Beth Whitehead case in the 1980s, where it was a traditional surrogate and she changed her mind and tried to run away with a child. It got pretty ugly. So after that, a couple states outlawed surrogacy. And we've only in the last like 5+ years seen those states kind of go into this reversal mode, where in 2015, I think that was when New Jersey reversed. In the last 5 years or so, they reversed. And then New York finally came around, where February 15th this year, 2021, they enact their new law became effective. However, so now you can have compensated surrogacy in New York, but only gestational. So
Right.
they left their criminal proceedings, those provisions that you can't compensate traditional or genetic surrogate in New York.
So they can still be a gestational surrogate, but not be paid.
Or genetic surrogate.
Yeah.
but not be paid.
Yes. So it's not criminal, but it's still complicated, where like no contract would be upheld, etc. So the law is still not supportive in New York of that.
So just in that realm, with the language changing, and you can imagine how the courts are not prepared.
For sure.
So
Yes.
obviously there are case precedences that are helpful, but aren't always applicable. And the one case that you talk about, which is landmark, is the Mary Beth?
Whitehead. Yeah.
Yeah, Whitehead.
That-
She contracted with a couple to be their surrogate and changed her mind.
Right. Yes. And I don't know if your listeners are curious about that changing their mind. I will say we get that question a lot as both an attorney and someone who works with a matching organization, where intended parents are so worried that someone will carry their child and then change their mind. And there's an attorney out in California, Andy Vorsimer, he's done these statistics where it's like 140 out of 144,000 surrogacy arrangements, only 13 gestational surrogates have changed their mind, and like 83 intended parents have changed their mind. So obviously they're like low numbers compared to the 144,000, but actually the fear should be more that the intended parents change their mind. And there's been some pretty scary high profile cases where like the Sherry Shepherd case, where she was an intended mother in a surrogacy arrangement and then decided she did not want to be a mother to that child.
So explain intended parent.
Yes. So that's the term we use for someone who plans to be a parent and is going through this through third-party reproduction. And that can be, we can use it for an egg donor, where they could be the intended mother, the intended parent could be the person carrying the pregnancy. Or in surrogacy, the intended parents aren't carrying the pregnancy. So that could be a single woman where, the surrogate's carrying her genetic child or not genetic child if they used a donor. It could be a couple, straight, or it could be a gay couple, and all different kinds of variations. But the intended parents are those who are planning to parent this child.
So what would happen then in a situation where the intended parent changes their mind in a surrogacy?
Yeah. So, I mean, even that, look, I mean, you heard the numbers, right? So even that luckily is very, very unlikely. And, people go through so much to get to this, where they've gone through years of infertility, and surrogacy is not inexpensive, as you can imagine, that it's very rare. But so cases like that, the Sherry Shepherd case, the court said, no, you are a parent to this child. And that, so she was alleging, fraud, that she was tricked into it. And the court said, no, you're a parent to this child. And I think in that case, she just pays, a huge amount of child support every month to the father who's raising the child.
Was this her oocyte that was used, or was it a donor?
It was a donor.
That might have been why she felt she could back out.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly that element of how people feel about the ties of a genetic related child or not, but I could see that definitely as being an element about her having those feelings.
So, what about birthrights? And when we have I know there was a pretty big case of a gay couple who had two children. One was considered a United States citizen and the other one wasn't. Are
Yeah.
you familiar with that case?
Very familiar. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's actually a series of cases where gay couples who went abroad for surrogacy then would try to bring their child or their children home to the United States. And the government would say, your child is not a US citizen. And so the twin one was especially stark and like shocking to hear that there was these twins born at the same time, born, by the same surrogate in Canada. And when they came to the US consulate, they said, show us the DNA testing. And in that case, so both dads are on both birth certificates. So legally, there is zero difference under Canadian law, and it should be the same under US law. But they said, show us the DNA testing. And the way this couple conceived is that they had the same egg donor, but they fertilized some eggs with one of the men's sperm and some with the other. And one was a US/Canadian dual citizen, and his husband was an Israeli citizen. So when they planned to move to Los Angeles to be closer to family to help with these twins and tried to bring the twins home, they said, oh, only the child genetically related to the U.S. citizen is a U.S. citizen and has rights to come to the U.S., despite both having the same legal parents. There's actually, I found that one's shocking. There's another one where we had the dads come on our podcast, the I Want to Put a Baby in You podcast, the Mize case, where both dads were U.S. citizens. But it like really gets into like the weeds about the immigration code. But like the shorthand is the immigration code says if a child is born of the marriage, then it's a U.S. citizen if one parent's a U.S. citizen. If the child is born out of wedlock, and yes, like our immigration code uses the term wedlock, which is kind of ridiculous. If they're born out of wedlock, then you have to be genetically related to one of the parents. You have to be related to one of the parents. And there's like this residency requirement that has to be you've like resided within 5 years, etc. So like absolutely shocking. So this really adorable couple, they met in New York. Both U.S. citizens. One was born and raised in Jackson, Mississippi. Like you can't really get more like American than Mississippi. But he met his husband in New York, and his mom was a U.S. citizen, but he grew up in England. And so when he tells this really sweet story about how at their wedding, his husband's friend from college in the UK was like, if you guys want kids, I can't do a British accent, but she was like, if you want kids, I am there for you. And like after some time went by, they like thought about it and they're like, we should get in touch with her. And they reach out and they're like, we'll just like do a chat. Like, how are you? And then like a month later, we'll like raise the subject. And they call and she's like, oh, you ready for kids? So she wanted to carry their child. So they used an egg donor. She gestationally carried their child in England. And then when they tried to bring their child home, so here's what's even more fascinating. So they tried to use the U.S. So the guy who grew up in Mississippi, sorry, if I use names, it'd be simpler. But anyway, so the man who grew up in Mississippi, they used his genetically related embryo first, and that transfer failed. And then there's like, okay, throw in the next best embryo, which happened to be the husband who grew up in England. That one took. So this is their daughter. When they go to bring her home, so they actually did make it home, but later they had to do testing and to try to get recognition of her U.S. citizenship. And they said, no, show us the DNA test. And the DNA test shows that the child was related to the husband, the father that grew up in the UK. So he didn't meet this residency requirement. So they were considering them under the unwed section, even though they are a wed. Sorry, it's like so in the weeds. I'm sorry. So here's the deal.
Complicated.
The U.S. Department of State only thinks that you are born of a marriage if both parents are genetically related to the child. If one is not genetically related to the child, they say that you're born out of wedlock. And so that's why like Immigration Equality, all these other organizations have been really active, like jumping on that, because it's clear discrimination against LGBT couples who will always have one partner, generally, who's not genetically related to the child.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And imagine how in the weeds it was before marriage equality. So where they don't even recognize a legal marriage. And then now it sounds like they still don't with the type of language that they're using.
Well, and the government was claiming like, oh, we're not discriminating because, a married heterosexual couple, if one was not genetically related, they'd have the same problem. It'd be considered the child's unwed. But the truth is, when you go to the consulate, it's discretionary whether you ask for DNA testing. So they generally are unlikely to ask a heterosexual couple for DNA testing, unlike two dads who show up and they're like, okay, who's the dad, right? Which is like always offensive. And
who's the dad? We are.
Yeah, we both are. We both are. Exactly. So.
Okay. So they need to maybe start using words genetic donor. I mean, I don't know, or maybe just change the laws, or maybe not be stupid. I don't know.
Well, the good news is with these series of cases, we've had a lot of progress where a Trump appointee judge in Georgia ruled, so that UK case, he ruled in favor of them. The Josh Banks, the twin case, they have repeatedly, so they won in the Ninth Circuit for their child to be granted a passport. So we've seen a lot of progress on those cases.
That's good. Encouraging.
That is good. Do you see more issues maybe in same-sex couples where it's two men versus two women? Do you see more issues that come to light?
So of those immigration cases, there's 3 or 4, and one is with two women that have the similar issue where there's not the genetic connection. But yes, I think we see it much more with gay men. And bizarrely, so in these immigration cases, the Department of State has said, okay, this unwed thing, we are actually going to say that if you are a woman that carried the child, but you're not genetically related. So for example, if a couple did reciprocal IVF, if you're not familiar, so if you have two women and one has their eggs retrieved and the other carries the child, they say, well, if you carry the child and you're not genetically related, we're still going to count that as being born of the marriage. So they have this like exception, which kind of makes their rules inconsistent as well. We're like, okay, if you're insisting on genetics, then why is there an exception here? So there's that part.
Because it sounds like the only difference is the uterus.
Right. So I guess having kind of two bites of the apple for a person with a uterus, that you can, be genetically related and have been the person who carried the child.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it's extra discrimination for the gay men out there trying to.
Wow. My next question was going to be, so where do you come in?
Yeah.
But you sort of clarified the need for a reproductive attorney to get people out of the weeds on this.
Well, I will say like my day-to-day job is like way more boring than most of these cases where, if you are entering into an egg donation arrangement, you're going to each have an attorney to talk about those important issues of, are there limitations on this donation? So for example, if I was donating to someone else, can they, if they have 20 embryos and then they have 2 kids, can they donate further those 18 embryos? Do I feel strongly about them not donating to research? How do I want, do I have a say in that? Also, what's our intent in terms of disclosure? Can they tell the child about my identity before 18 right away? What other obligations do we have to disclose information to each other? And a basic is like, if I find out I have a genetic condition, then I should tell them, and vice versa. If my recipient has a child and they show up with a genetic issue, they should let me know, because that could affect me, my family, my future children, etc. So working at all of those. So similarly with surrogacy agreements, which are even longer because there's a long period and lots of complicated issues to think about. I mean, even these days with COVID, where it's become a hot issue, and hopefully this will be resolved shortly as time passes. But right now it's a big issue of like, if someone is acting as a gestational carrier, will she get the COVID vaccine? And there is a lot of strong feelings on different areas. And so it's almost become like a matching issue of like, if you're a good fit for each other, depending on how you feel about the COVID vaccine.
Right.
Wow, that's a big one for me. That's a big one.
Oh, really?
Oh, for sure.
Tell.
Yeah, that would be.
Betsy, are you an anti-vaxxer?
I am not an anti-vaxxer, but my kids are vaccinated and I'm vaccinated. But I would have some questions about the COVID vaccine with
Sure,
pregnancy.
right?
Yeah.
Because it's so new. Pregnancy is this unique stage. Like,
Yep.
does it affect the child?
Yep.
Yeah.
So lots of like very legitimate questions and concerns. Sure. But yeah, so most of my day is like contract review, education, negotiation. But then for like my weekly articles, I get to write about kind of like the thing. Luckily, knock on wood, it's never been one of my cases so far. But when the cases go wrong, that's what I get to write about and do the podcast about and find about what happens on the edge when things really go wrong.
But what happens? So what would be the biggest flaw you've seen in this type of, because it is kind of contractual law, right? I mean, in some regards. So what would be the biggest loophole?
So I'll tell you one case that still like boggles my mind. And this, not to like keep plugging my podcast, but we had these, I was so honored that we finally, after like a year begging them, they finally came on our podcast. But so there is this couple out of Virginia. So gay couple, married, really great guys. They went through surrogacy to have children. So they had 2 daughters. I believe their first 2 surrogates were in California. And then they had friends who were like, hey, we have an extra embryo. I think maybe it was extra 2 embryos. We would really like to donate them to you if you would consider having another child. We see you're such great dads. And they said, at first they thought their family was complete. They're like, okay, maybe we'll do this. So they decided to go through having a 3rd child. They went through an agency to find a surrogate, and their surrogate, so gestational carrier, she's going to carry this donated embryo, was in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is like Colorado, where there's no law, there's no specific surrogacy law, but generally the courts are very friendly, where they grant pre-birth orders, they recognize legal parents, like it's generally pretty smooth. So that's how Colorado is. And this is why I'm scared for Colorado, because of this Wisconsin case. So everything seems to be going smoothly. Like their surrogate got pregnant. Everything's going well. They're really excited for the arrival of their son. And somehow they are appointed this really extreme judge. And the judge decides that surrogacy and this arrangement is human trafficking. He literally calls them human traffickers in one of the decisions. And he denies them parental rights. So baby's now born. He says they are not the legal parents. He said the gestational carrier, she is definitely not the legal parent. The baby is a legal orphan. I mean, it just like got worse and worse. And then he appointed like his buddy as like the guardian ad litem to be an attorney specifically for the child, who just like rang up like $100,000 in legal bills, obviously supporting this like extreme vision of the judge. And it was just this nightmare for these poor dads. But fortunately, like they had means, although they talk about like refinance, they had to like remortgage their house 3 times to pay $500,000 or so in legal bills to fight this for their son. And at this time, their son is like home with them, at least in Virginia. So they have like temporary custody, but no legal rights. But they talk about in the middle of the night, they're like scared, like they could come and take our son at any moment. And he could just be thrown into the foster care system. And who knows what could happen to this boy that we love so much. And only once the judge stepped down to run for the Supreme Court of Wisconsin were they assigned a new judge. So a year of like this absolute nightmare. And then this new judge is like, what is going on here? And reversed everything and gave them parental rights. But I mean, what if that judge didn't step down? I mean, the whole story is horrible and heartbreaking. And after that, they worked really hard to pass a law in Virginia, which is called Jacob's Law, after their son, which recognizes the recipients of embryo donations as parents. So that was a big thing that they did.
Wow.
How is this on any level in the best interest for Jacob?
Yeah.
It's not, right? What was this judge doing?
You
Like,
have two people who put
loving
a lot
family.
I know.
I mean, at least they had temporary custody. So
well,
at least they got to do some
at
bonding.
least,
Like,
I
but
mean,
goodness gracious,
Yeah.
I can't imagine.
That's horrifying. That's not
Totally horrifying.
right. It almost sounds like a moral judgment, not a legal judgment that was handed down.
Yeah. I
And
know,
when you-
absolutely. It was that, only a married man and woman can be, it's so extreme.
Wow.
Okay. So that and that's what we were talking about a little bit earlier. These are precedences that go on the books that people can start using as arguments to support
fortunately,
similar cases.
That one is not a precedent. Luckily, with the new judge, everything was so everything was reversed. But yeah, so luckily that is not. I mean, there are like of the crazy cases, like there was one. So on a sperm donation, a same-sex couple in Mississippi, they used an anonymous sperm donor to have a child, like very, still very common for same-sex female couples. And in their case, when they split up and were going through a divorce, the biologically related mom argued that her now ex was not a legal parent to the child. And these courts, which again had these kind of, these prejudicial feelings, they said the judge ruled that's right, that the biological mother and the anonymous sperm donor are the legal parents to this child. And, non-bio mom who's been raising this child forever, nope, you have no parental rights. Like, absolutely mind-blowing. And that was upheld on the appellate level in Mississippi, and only in the Mississippi Supreme Court did they reverse it. And that was 2017. Like, this isn't a case that's like 20, 30 years ago. These are cases that keep happening by judges where they don't get it.
When we talk about these custody cases, and that's actually a case I was talking to my staff about the other day, is that's divorce is not a lot of fun anyway, but it's always mind-numbing to me that people will use children as this tool to hurt the other parent. And I just because you didn't birth a baby or it's not your genetic material doesn't mean you don't have this parental attachment or this, you know what I mean? It's horrible to make that judgment just based on genetics. And so we have issues, we talk about, as you know, we have anonymous donors and we have directed donors, and directed donors are directed or known donors. They're known to the intended recipients. And so we get in, that can get complicated too with respect to where, let's say a couple is doing home insemination with a known donor that's unscreened. This is one of my favorite topics. So they're just using fresh ejaculate at home, syringe, turkey base, or whatever. And then this donor thinks that they're off the hook for financial support if challenged in court. Is that because we truly try to send all of our directed donors to you to make sure that they are covered with respect to what their responsibilities are emotionally and legally and financially.
And first, I want to say, like, yay to directed donors. Like, I think, the anonymous kind of the framework that we've had for so many years does have certain challenges that have made things really hard, where DNA tests now, you will find out. So I think, there's just been this, like, there's donors now who are, people who are donor conceived that have like this big right to know movement about right to biological information. So I feel like known donations really super, are nice, that you avoid those issues. Like, all the information's out there. People know that. But home insemination. So the law varies state to state. And in Colorado, we have a statute that's 194106 that says you must conceive under the supervision of a licensed physician or advanced practice nurse. And if you don't conceive under those circumstances, then you don't fall within the statute, which means you might not be recognized as a parent, or more, scary for the donor, he might be recognized as the parent and might be on the hook for child support. And often parties are like, well, I know, we know each other, we trust each other. Mm-hmm. So we always like to point to the Kansas case. So there's this the Kansas Craigslist case, we often call it, where there was a same-sex couple and they went on Craigslist to find a donor. They found someone. They did an at-home contract. So at least they good points for doing a contract, even though you really should have attorneys to tell you what the law was. So I think the donor thought he was fine. I think the moms thought they were fine. But then one of them had some health issues. She went on disability. And at that point, the state of Kansas, I think, was looking for money. And they went after the donor, saying that you owe child support. So even though all of the parties agreed who the parents were, the state of Kansas says, you did not follow our statute, which is similar to Colorado, that said you had to be under a licensed physician. So no supervision, not a donor, your dad, you owe child support, and then non-biological mom was like left in the cold as not being recognized as a legal parent. So I will tell you, like, from our like attorneys in my area, like so many of them like dedicated their time and energy to fight this pro bono. And ultimately on the appellate level, they did rule that the non-biologically related mom had greater rights to being a parent than the donor. But I mean, I tell people, like, what if it was a single mom? Like you wouldn't even have that argument. Like donors like on the hook for child support for 18 years.
Yeah, and we try to protect the directed donors because they come in, it's a big deal. Like you said, hats off to these people who are doing this because it's involved and it's a lot of time and energy for them to do that. Even if they're not paying for it, if the recipients are paying for it, it's still, we want to make sure that they understand really what they're getting into and make sure that they've discussed what their legal protections are, because sometimes it's, they don't want co-parenting. They just are like, I'm just a donor.
Yeah.
And I don't want, and some want legal rights. And then I'm like, well, then you need to set that up. And of course we give them your name, but, but we have, yeah. But what do you think about all these cases where you have these sperminators flying around the country and what is with this? There's what's the fella? He's an attorney even.
There's an attorney one?
Yes, he's an attorney, and his latest, I don't know, I don't want to use their conquest, but he puts it out there, and he's what we call live cover or fresh ejaculate unscreened. I don't know, maybe he tests himself often, I don't know. But the people have to be at least 18, I guess, because that's a magic number.
Good.
And
at least that.
One of his latest pregnancies is with an 18-year-old who is on government support and was so excited to have his baby. And he was so excited talking it up in the media. And I'm trying to figure out what his financial obligations are. I do know that at least 4 women have sued him for child support. And
you're talking about the math professor in New York. Is that?
Yeah, this is a different guy though, but
really?
Maybe it might be this one.
Maybe it's just very similar, but there is this sperminator. I don't know, one of these.
That's what they call themselves.
What was there? There's some other term I heard too. Oh, I can't think of it. But yeah, there was a big one that was in. So Ari Nagel is the professor out of New York that has been all over the news, and he's been. I feel like I haven't seen as much recently about him, but he donates his sperm and he talks about donating in like Target bathrooms and
yes, I remember the story.
And I mean the other part, like they talk about natural insemination, aka having sex with your recipient, which under any statute is not within the donor realm at all. Like your dad, like you're like a one night, a hookup, like you're still a legal dad. And I think I know in his case, I've heard of at least like 4 or 5 cases where he is obligated to pay child support. And his got even more interesting. There was a part where he was flying to Israel to donate there. And he ended up getting banned because under Israeli law, you have to be either anonymous or you have to be supporting the child. So which I thought was really fascinating. So since he wasn't actually taking that role of supporting and parenting the child, and he wasn't anonymous to these women, they banned him from donating anymore in the country. So, which is kind of impressive to get banned from a whole country from donating.
Yeah, that kind of gives me glee, though. I'm not gonna lie. And then one of the last things that we worked on together recently is posthumous parenting or donating. You and I definitely have had a lot of conversations around this, and as you know, consent for us is critical. Consent of the donor is critical, and if somebody is on life support or has recently passed, they can't give consent. And so, talk a little bit about how the conversations we've had, how this has evolved, and
yeah, it's definitely a really fascinating area to consider. Can you conceive children from the genetics of someone who has passed. And now the technology is certainly there, not only to conceive using cryopreserved sperm or eggs or embryos that they may have had cryopreserved during their lifetime, but also, I know we've talked about this, you can do postmortem retrieval, where even if they hadn't had those reproductive cells removed from their body during their lifetime, there's a short period of 24 hours or so where you can have them retrieved. And there's been a number of cases where sometimes the spouse or a fiance or even the parents are, asking that their now deceased loved one have their reproductive material retrieved from their body. And one of the big cases recently was of a West Point cadet in New York who was in a ski accident and was on life support, and his parents requested that his sperm be retrieved for the purpose of conception later. And I mean, the really fascinating part in that case was that, he wasn't married. There wasn't like a partner asking to conceive with these. It was the parents. And they argued that partially it was cultural, that it was so important for them to have this genetic continuation, biological continuation, or legacy, or some of the words I've heard. And I will say, I'll give these talks on these issues, and there is this YouTube video by Irit Rosenblum in Israel, who started the BioWill. And if you go on YouTube and type Irit Rosenblum BioWill, there is this like amazing video where she talks about how for military extreme sports enthusiasts, etc., they can donate their material to be used after their conception, like really, really taking that thought, as a very legitimate thing, that people want their biological continuation to happen after their death. But it's so complicated, right? Because if that wasn't your intention, then, even in the New York case, he didn't sign anything specifically. Right. He didn't have consent that said, I want my genetics used after my death. Right. But they pointed to he always talked about having kids. He always talked about having a family. But then often people want to make the distinction, and a very fair distinction, having kids that you raise and it's during your lifetime is very different than having your genetics taken for children after your death. Yeah. So lots of interesting, complicated issues in the area.
Right. And we of course get not a ton of calls, but enough that, we are often the bad guy in that episode, because it's usually either a young married or fiance or girlfriend. Parents call us, my boyfriend, husband, fiance, whatever, was in an accident on life support, and we'd like to retrieve his sperm to be used later. And I say, great. Do you have consent, something in writing that allows me to do that was his intent, was to have children with you? Well, no, but we have conversations. And I said, that's hearsay, can't do that. I need something in writing. We have to go off of consent. And then they get upset. I think I had one couple that had just seen a fertility specialist and had consult, and I was like, that's good enough, right? I mean, they were there. I said, okay, we have it in writing that he signed, this consent to proceed on these procedures that they were going to be doing, and physician notes.
Did it say consent for after his death?
It didn't, though. See, but so.
I mean, from both sides. So even
I hear you. 100%.
So one couple that was successful, there was this Iowa case where fiance was on life support, and the fiance is like, oh, we wanted to have kids, and the parents were absolutely on board, and the hospital's like, no, without a court order. And they were able to get a court order. And the big kicker was they got an affidavit from one of the drafters of UAGA, which is the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, arguing that UAGA did cover sperm. So of course, if someone dies, there's pretty loose standards of who can make that decision for you under the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. So if I die and they're asking my family, oh, are you next of kin? Which again is pretty loose. I could be a child, right? And it would apply to a child, and you can donate your liver, your lungs, your heart, etc. And that's what UAGA is generally used for. But in this case, they argued that applied to sperm too. So of course, parents can make the decision about the tissue or organs of their soon-to-be deceased son.
Yes, but I specifically remember speaking with Colorado on that issue for organ donation, and they specifically left it out because of the complications of that tissue, because it's the only tissue you donate that has inheritance rights, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, your liver doesn't inherit an estate, and your cornea and your ligaments, but your DNA does. And I think that was the real defining point for them, that they're not going to consider it a transplantable tissue and not going to put it on the list. And
so
the
far, although the
Yeah.
technology is now that you can take a skin cell, right, and turn it into a sperm or an ova.
Well,
So
I think that came out of Japan, and it wasn't repeatable. So
oh no,
I don't think the research was.
I've been seeing articles lately that they've been advancing on that. So we'll see.
Well, then I guess your liver could, inherit an estate. But
yes, exactly.
The issue would be for us is that there's FDA involved, right? Because this is a tissue that is FDA regulated. And if, for instance, this cadet did not have a sexually intimate partner, they retrieved his sperm, and then they're going to use an oocyte donor or not, or they have to have an egg in there somewhere. And then somebody has to carry that pregnancy. But all of those people involved will have not been sexually intimate with this cadet. And so FDA has something to say about that, because if you're not a sexually intimate partner, you fall under the directed donor or known donor statute, and you have to be screened and quarantined. And so how is that even possible to get around FDA, especially with that incident with this cadet? Because specifically, FDA was in my lab inspecting us when that happened. I brought that story up to the investigator.
Oh, what'd they say?
He said, "Oh, well, we're going to have a meeting about this when I get back."
Ooh.
And he said, "This is not." His take was, "This is not how our regulation reads." And so I think emotionally, it helps people maybe move forward, or maybe not. Maybe it holds them in the past. I have mixed feelings about that. You and I have discussed this in great length.
Yeah.
But in the end, it may be even a bigger letdown because they're denied because of other regulations, besides just consent, that won't allow this tissue to be utilized. So in that regard, we came up with a contract that we now have on our website. And we encourage all young men to download it and fill it out and sign it and have it notarized and have it on file.
Women too.
Women too. Oh,
a little
yes,
more complicated, but absolutely women too. But if you have any intention that you want your genetic reproductive material to be used after your death, please sign something so that there aren't these legal complications for your family.
Yes, and be clear about it. But so I don't want to end on a downer, but
the death note.
The death note. But I think it takes us full circle, right? And so that's an important piece for our listeners to understand, is that it's not as easy as just a sperm and an egg meeting and, let's do this. So,
something I was going to bring up, which is not third party, well, partially. So have you seen all these articles now that that sperm count across the world has dropped by over 50%? I think you're going to need security guards, Betsy, at your sperm bank. Like, you're going to have like solid gold. Like, the last hope for for humanity is going to be in your sperm bank.
Oh, well, thanks. It is so strange that you bring that up, because I was actually having that same thought. Was, oh no, we're going to have to put up barbed wire fence and get Doberman pinchers to patrol our lab. Forget the camera thing, but it's true though. And Ellen, you and I've talked about it, and I've been saying this. I've been in this world for almost 34 years, and sperm production is declining. It is a fact. And I don't, in the animal industry.
I've heard plastics, but do you have any thoughts?
Oh, it's so multifactorial though, right?
Yeah.
Because you have so many environmental factors, you have genetic factors. I mean, you have people that we're able to let them have, they're able to genetically reproduce, whereas decades ago, this wouldn't have happened for them, right? And we have some genetic issues, things that are inherited. And reproduction, even though lowly inherited, can be one of them. So you have that. You have diet. You have obesity. You have definitely environmental exposures like plastics, for sure, And evolutionarily, things might just be slowing down because maybe the planet's getting too full. I don't know. I don't think really anybody knows. But I will tell you, it is on the decline, for sure.
Yeah. Get those dogs.
Yeah, the next Ocean's 11 will be about breaking into a sperm
Yes,
bank.
a sperm bank. Yes.
Great.
Absolutely.
Thanks. I
Ocean's
won't be
11
sleeping
plus 1.
for a while now on that. But no, this has been very enlightening, and I'm pretty sure people are fascinated by the complexities, because really in this short podcast we've just skimmed the top, and Ellen,
absolutely.
you know that for sure. But again, I want to thank you for being here, being in our corner, and helping people get where they need to get as legally as possible.
Well, thanks for having me.
I would have never thought of posthumous, genetic collection. Like, I would have never thought to, gosh, he's dead now, I'd like to have his babies.
I know.
I mean, these thoughts would have never occurred to me. So
I don't know. We do get these calls.
Yeah.
Not daily, but I'll bet you we get 2 a year, which is a lot, really. And they're always on weekends, right? And I mean, not always, but a lot. And I always have to be the bearer of bad news.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this one case decades ago. I was I was teaching at UNC, and one of my students, a friend of hers who was all of 19 and young married, her husband was testing a small little road bike that he had built for the neighbor's kid. And he was taking it just down the road for a short spin and popped a wheelie and hit his head. Wasn't wearing a helmet, but it's low to the ground, popped, and he was lucid and everything. And they said, well, we should take you to the hospital. So they call an ambulance. He's lucid, talking everything in the ambulance, and he codes. Okay. And so by the time they get to the hospital, he's put on life support and he's brain dead. It's just a freak accident.
Yeah.
Right. And my student had told her about what I do and said, you should call her. They can store his sperm. So I get the call, it's the weekend, and I'm a hard no on this, right? Because I don't have written consent. She called every news agency in the state of Colorado. I had every channel calling me on my doorstep. Everybody, what are you doing? This is so horrible. I went on the Tom Green show to talk about it, the morning show. Wow. And I had to explain to them that there was no consent here, right? And it's a huge issue. Yeah. And she wasn't channeling her grief. It was a difficult thing. She's 19. And for me to say to her, you'll find love again, is not something she needed to hear. Right. But hanging on to his genetics wasn't going to bring him back. And that's, I think, what's her goal. And so there's this layer of emotional stuff that happens. And that's why Ellen and I came up with this contract that really is on Cryogham's website that you can download to say, these are my wishes and demands in case I'm incapacitated.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. There was a whole bunch that she talked about that it just was eye-opening to me, because I know nothing about reproductive law, and
right.
all the stuff that goes with it. So
right. And of course, it all falls under the umbrella of reproductive health.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, it's never a dull moment, always things in litigation. Contracts are written as tight as they can, but they can always be broken. And it's really interesting how some judges will define family and some...
Yeah, there's so much that goes. I mean, every one of the cases she talked about, there were just so many different factors and so many different things complicating them. Just like, wow, there's a lot of different laws that pertain to all of this, and a lot of different things that go into it. So
did you get the sense that men were discriminated against a little bit?
Oh, in parenting?
Didn't you think that was interesting?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, but it doesn't surprise me much.
Right.
But yeah, it's very interesting that it's so obviously there.
Well, I hope our listeners really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Because I know I did.
Jinx.
Oh, me a coat.
This podcast was created to promote Look Both Ways in the textbook written by Dr. Cairo. Look Both Ways is a nonprofit organization based in Loveland, Colorado, with a mission to educate our youth about their reproductive health to make informed decisions for their future. We do this by educating the educators through professional development, and we also put on free conferences for both teens and parents of teens. Textbooks used at schools are donated by Look Both Ways to eliminate the money obstacle for schools interested in piloting or adopting our curriculum and textbook. As a nonprofit, we're always fundraising and accepting donations. For more information about Look Both Ways, our fundraising efforts, getting a textbook donated to you, or to make a donation, please visit lookbothways.us. That's LOOKBOTHWAYS.US. This podcast was produced by Peach Islander Productions in Fort Collins, Colorado. This is Mandy Johnson
and Dr. B.
wishing you well.
Be sure and catch all our episodes of It's Not Human Sexuality on Spotify, Podbean, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay.